Gormenghast. Chapter 24. The floor of the quadrangle was of a pale whitish-yellow brick, a pleasant mellow colour, soothing to the eye. The bricks had been laid so that their narrow surfaces faced upwards, a device which must have called for twice as many as would otherwise have been necessary. But what gave the floor of the quadrangle its peculiar character was the herringbone pattern which the artificers had followed many 100 years ago. Blurred and worn as the yellow bricks had become, yet there was a vitality about the surface of the quadrangle, as though the notion of the man who had once long ago given orders that the bricks were to be laid in such and such a way was still alive. The bricks had breath in them. To walk across the quadrangle was to walk across an idea. The pillars of the cloisters had been painted, a dreadful idea, for the dove-grey stone of which they were constructed could not have harmonized more subtly with the pale yellow brickwork from which they seemed to grow. They had, nevertheless, been painted a deep and most oppressive red. It is true that on the following day an army of boys would be set to work in scraping the colour off again, but on the one day of the year when the quadrangle came into its own as the setting for the poet's declamation, it seemed doubly outrageous to smother up the soft grey stone. The poet's rostrum, set against the red pillars, glowed and darkened only to glow again in the afternoon sunlight. The branch of a tree fluttered across the face of the sun, so that the quadrangle, which was filled with benches, appeared on the move, for the flickering shadows of the leaves swam to and fro as the high branch swayed in the breeze. The silent congregation, seated solemnly on their benches, stared over their shoulders at the gate through which the poet would at any moment make his entrance. It was a year since anyone present had caught sight of that tall and awkward man, and then it was at this same ceremony which, on that previous occasion, had taken place in a thin and depressing drizzle. The Countess was seated in advance of the front row. Fuchsia's chair was to her mother's left. Standing beside them, with the sweat of irritable anxiety pouring down his face, was Barquentine, with his eyes fixed, as were the eyes of the Countess and Fuchsia, not upon the poet's gate, but upon a small door in the south wall of the quadrangle, through which Titus, who was over 20 minutes late, should long ago have come running. Behind them, in a long row, as though their yellow bench was a perch for black turkeys, sat the professors. Belgrove, at their centre, in his zodiac gown, was also staring at the small door in the wall. He took out a big, grubby handkerchief and mopped his brow. At that moment the door was pulled open, and 3 boys ran through and came panting up to Barquentine.
"Well," hissed the old man, "well, have you found him?"
"No, sir," they panted. "We can't find them anywhere, sir." Barquentine ground the foot of his crutch against the pale bricks as though to ease his anger. Suddenly Steerpike appeared at his side as though out of the mellow ground. He bowed to the Countess, while a shadow undulated across the irregular terrain of the scores of heads that filled the quadrangle. The Countess made no response. Steerpike straightened himself. "I can find no trace of the 77th Earl," he said, addressing Barquentine.
"Black blood!"
The voice of the cripple forced its way between his teeth.
"This is the 4th time that
what?" The Countess launched the 3 short words as though they were made of lead. They fell heavily through the afternoon air. Barquentine gathered his red rags of office about his stunted body and turned his irritable head to the Countess, who stared at him with ice in her eyes. The old man bowed, sucking at his teeth as he did so.
"My lady," he said,
This is the 4th time in 6 months that the 77th Earl has absented himself from the sacred by the least hair of the child's head,
said the Countess, interrupting, in a voice of deadly deliberation.
If he should absent himself 100 times an hour, I will not have his misdemeanours bandied about in public. I will not have you mouth and blurt his faults. You will keep your observations in your own throat. My son is no chattel that you can discuss, Barquentine, with your pale lieutenant. Leave me. The occasion will proceed. Find a substitute for the boy from the Tyro's benches. You will retire."
At that moment a murmur was heard from the populace behind them, for the poet, preceded by a man in the skin of a horse, and with that animal's tail trailing the bricks behind him as he paced slowly forwards, was to be seen emerging from the gate. The poet in his gown, with a beaker of moat water in his left hand and his manuscript in his right, followed the figure in the horse's hide with long, awkward paces. His face was like a wedge. His small eyes flickered restlessly. He was pale with embarrassment and apprehension. Steerpike had found a boy of about Titus's age and height and instructed him in his role, which was simple enough. He was to stand where the rest were seated, and to sit when the rest were standing. And that was all, as 77th Earl, by proxy, he had to remember. When the Countess had placed the pebble from Gormenghast river in the beaker of moat water, and when the populace had seated themselves again, and none save the poet and the substitute for Titus were left on their feet, then an absolute hush descended over the quadrangle, and the poet, holding his poem in his hand and raising his head, lifted his hollow voice. "To her ladyship, Gertrude, Countess of Groan, and to her children, Titus the 77th Lord of the Tracts, and Fuchsia, sole vessel of the blood on the distaff side. To all ladies and gentlemen present, to all hereditary officials, to all of varying duties whose observance of the tenets justify their presence at the ceremony, I dedicate this poem, which as the law's decree shall be addressed to as many as are here present in all the variance of their receptivity, status, and acumen, insomuch as poetry is a ritual of the heart, the voice of faith, the core of Gormenghast, the moon when it is red, the trumpet of the groans." The poet paused to breathe. The words he had just used were invariably declaimed before the poem, and there was nothing left for the poet to do but to open the door of the wire cage, which Barquentine had passed up to him, and to let loose the magpie as a symbol of something the significance of which had long been lost to the records. The magpie, which was supposed to flap away into the afternoon sunlight until it was a mere dot in the sky, did no such thing. It hopped from the cage and stood for a moment on the rim of the rostrum before flying with a loud rattle of its wings to the Countess, on whose shoulder it perched for the rest of the proceedings, pecking from time to time at its black wings. The poet, raising his manuscript before his eyes, took a deep and shuddering breath, opened his small mouth, took a step backwards, and losing his balance, all but fell from the steps that descended steeply from his narrow rostrum to the ground 7 feet below. An uncontrollable shriek of laughter from the Tyro's benches stabbed into the warm afternoon like a needle into a cushion. The offending youth was led away by an official. The drowsy silence came down again, drowning the shadow-dappled quadrangle as though with an element. The poet moved forward on the rostrum, his skin prickly with shame. He raised his manuscript again to read, and as he read, the shadows lengthened across the quadrangle. A cloud of starlings moved like migraine across the upper air. The small boys on the Tyro's benches, imitating the poet and nudging one another, fell, one by one, asleep. The Countess yawned. The summer afternoon melted into evening. Steerpike's eyes moved to and fro. Barquentine sucked his teeth irritably. The voice of the poet droned on and on. A star came out, and then another. The earth swam on through space. The Countess yawned again and turned her eyes to the west doorway. Where was Titus?